All right, welcome to another episode of Suturing Time.
Mhm.
And today we were going to do another episode where we do a recap and a discussion of a YouTube video. And we're doing one that Phil had run across. And the guy on the YouTube video is Jeff Booth. Some of you may be familiar with them. The title of the YouTube video is "We Are in Fold 34: How Exponentiality Will Change Our Understanding of Economics." And I'll put a link to the video in the show description. But Jeff Booth is the author of a book called The Price of Tomorrow. And basically, the premise of not only, I guess, this video, but his book is that the collision of two powerful forces, one being deflation driven by technology and the other being inflation driven by central banking in our current monetary and political system. So I'll kind of review what was covered in the video and encourage everybody to watch it. But basically, he discusses both of those points and what's happening as they collide, and each one basically accelerates. So he starts out by talking about the advancement of technology, and he first talks about Moore's law, which is just basically the speed with which processing power has, increases with computer chips. So he showed a picture of a computer chip from 1985, and it had 25,000 transistors on the chip. And then he showed one from 2021, from last year, one of Apple's processors that they use in their computers, just the personal computers, and it had 57 billion transistors. So, that would be like, if my math's right, that's like over 2 million times more transistors in the one from last year versus one from 1985. So that's like 35 years or so. So it's like half a lifetime, not even half a lifetime. So he did that to kind of set the stage to so people could see how fast technology's progressing, even though it's pretty obvious to anybody who's lived. And then he shows some clips of robots, and they starts out with what they're doing, simple tasks. And this was like about 10 years ago. And then he kind of progresses through time, and you can see a tremendous leap over the past year. And so his point in setting this up is to try to show that, like, if you were to guess a timeline of those robots, you may have guessed that transition between the different tasks that these robots were doing was, most people might guess it's of an exponential nature, but not so much of this parabolic shift like within the last year, where the capabilities of these robots is quickly increasing. So, and I thought what was interesting, and I guess I never shy away from a chance to pick on Paul Krugman, but his point is that it's very hard for people to grasp the exponential growth of technology. And he used an example of folding paper. And he took a sheet of paper and he folded it a few times. And he asked the question, if I folded this paper 50 times, folded it on itself, so fold it in half again, etc., you do that 50 times, how tall would that be? And apparently it would go from here to the sun. And so his point is that it's very, very difficult for people to kind of understand or project the growth of technology and how that will change the world. And so, as an interesting, kind of a funny quote, I have to get to my computer and pull it up here, but he quoted Paul Krugman, our favorite Nobel laureate, an economist. And I'll read the quote that Paul Krugman has from 1998 that he provided in this YouTube, that Jeff Booth provided in this YouTube video. And his quote was, he's talking about the internet and its potential growth. He said, quote, "The growth of the internet will slow drastically as the flaw in Metcalfe's law, which states that the number of potential connections in a network is proportional to the square of the number of participants, becomes apparent. Most people have nothing to say to each other. By 2005 or so, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than the fax machines. So he's saying that the internet's not going to grow much. It's not going to be as impactful as the fax machine, and that Metcalfe's law doesn't apply to the internet because nobody on the internet would, in any conceivable way have anything to say to each other or any information to communicate to each other. So, I mean, it's funny, but that's a Nobel Prize winning economist trying to predict how technology is going to affect the economy. So, Phil and I did an episode on Paul Krugman, and I'll put a show about another comment that he made through Twitter, where he basically opined that inflation is not particularly difficult to people in low income wage earners. So he uses that to set the stage. Technology is growing fast. It's hard for people to comprehend it. Even people who should be in a position to comprehend it, it's hard to do so. I don't know that Paul Krugman's the best example because I don't know how much he comprehends reality. But basically, he sets up this collision of two great forces, one being technology and the other being inflation through central banking. And so you can think of money as an abstract concept for time. It's the store of value, and it's a means of exchanging that value so you can perform work today, store the value of the work that you created and spend it in the future, so to say. Now, with technology, that wants to free up our time because as you make goods, as you make things, as technology progresses, it becomes cheaper to produce things. So conceivably, you shouldn't have to work as hard to produce the same amount of goods. So basically, technology should free us up from performing certain tasks and lead to more free time. So no, but we live in a system that's based on inflation. So, and there's always been this assumption that an economy needs inflation. Now, why? Well, I mean, we could discuss that, I guess. But when you think about where we're at now, and we could circle back at some point and discuss, like, maybe it was beneficial, to get us to where we're at now. Mm-hmm. But at this point in time, it basically just amounts to a transfer of wealth. Let's just say they target about a 2% inflation rate. So they want any dollar you make this year, they want you to be able to buy 2% less with it next year. So they think they're doing fantastic if they meet that metric. But basically all that is transferring 2% of money from the poor to the wealthy. So it's just a theft rate of 2%, and that's supposed to be great. Now, what that theft rate should be before it becomes a problem, it's kind of interesting how people think that if somebody steals 2% from you a year, you don't notice it that much in a short period of time. And, I guess you don't raise a stink, but if somebody starts stealing 20% of your money every year, then people start to think about it. And so then one has to say, well, why does the system exist that we live in a system where basically 2% of the money is stole from the masses and given to the wealthy? Well, it's because people vote, and people always want to get more than they should actually have. So they want to put the bill off to the future. They want to pass on the bill. And it's just like people with credit cards, people with anything. They want to have more today and pay for it tomorrow. So the politicians will always pander to the voters. So then you have this question. You have this system that is set up, and I'll talk about some dollars behind it. But the ultimate question is you have this system that is set up that relies on inflation. But how can this inflation persist if you have an exponential growth in technology which is deflationary in nature. It's an opposition of two quickly growing forces. And at some point, his point is that something has to give. So just to kind of set the stage, we talked about the technology, but to set the stage of the other rapidly growing force being inflation and central banking, he throws some figures around, and his figures are from 2019 when he wrote his book. But when he did his research, he found that in the current system at that time in 2019, there was $250 trillion worth of debt to keep an $80 trillion global economy running. And of that $250 trillion of global debt, 185 trillion of that 250 trillion total had come about in the last 20 years. So you can see it's to keep it going, to kind of keep the fraud going. And I know it's a harsh word, but to keep the Ponzi going, it's growing exponentially. So I actually looked up on my own. I didn't get this from his video. The rest of the stuff I all got from the video, which I encourage people to watch. But just looking at my own, I wanted to see, because of COVID, he wrote this book before COVID hit. And so a lot of money was spent, and we've had a lot of inflation because of that, to try to lubricate the gears of our current inflationary system, so to avoid a complete collapse in the credit system. So interestingly, from February of 2020 to November of 2021, the M2 money supply, which you can think of as just all the dollars in the system, in the United States increased by 38.6%. So that's an increase. Yeah, that's an increase of almost, on an annualized basis, nearly 25% a year for almost 2 years. So when you think about it, that's based on that. Like, if your house didn't go up by 38% of that time, you were losing money. And if you didn't own a house, you were screwed. So anyway, that's so basically the central banks they get co-opted by the governments because the people demand more and more without paying for it in the present moment. So that's kind of like his two opposing forces. And then he kind of talks about historically how, he talked about the printing presses a little bit, and how they led to information becoming widely available, and that allowed knowledge to increase at an ever growing pace, because basically the church no longer controlled all the information. And he pointed out how most of this technologically driven deflationary pressures are still ahead of us. Meanwhile, the central banks must still keep printing, or we'll have a complete collapse in our credit system. So his big question is, well, what gives? And he goes on to argue that there's kind of he goes on to argue that it's hard to solve a problem from within the system itself. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the snowflake versus avalanche thing. You have people trying to look at which individual snowflakes are a problem. Meanwhile, they have an avalanche coming down the mountain at them, and they're looking at the snowflakes coming down. And so basically, he lays out what he calls a paradox, and that you have, on one side, you have accelerating technological growth that absolutely requires a digitally native currency that allows for deflation, because goods should become cheaper over time. And at the same time, you have a system that's built on credit that can't allow that, out of fear that you would have a cascading credit collapse and a complete collapse of our current monetary system. So he goes on, he quotes another guy, and I could pull up the quote. I'm assuming he's an Austrian economist or something. I wasn't familiar with him. But basically, his solution that he kind of proposed, and this is not a financial advice show or anything like that, he says like a potential solution would be like Bitcoin as an open decentralized monetary network that can't be stopped. And I'll read the quote from the guy that I'll pull it up here and read it. But then Phil and I, we can discuss. That's kind of my breakdown of the show of the show. But so it was a guy named F.A. Hayek, Hayek. And
he's an Austrian economist, yeah.
Okay, so I figured. So he said, I don't believe we shall ever have a good money again, before we take the thing out of the hands of government. That is, we can't take them violently out of the hands of government. All we can do is, by some sly roundabout way, introduce something they can't stop. And so Jeff Booth thinks that, Bitcoin is the closest thing to that we have. But anyway, I kind of rambled on for quite a while, but I figured I would just kind of set the stage by trying to just condense. I think that's what his points are. And if you want to add, if I missed anything, Phil, but basically it's that paradox where we're in a system that can't basically can't allow technology, the accelerating technological growth, to drive deflation, because our current monetary system, central-based system that depends on credit expanding, ever more quickly, in order to avoid collapse. Those two things are giant forces and so he also put, pictures of people, it's driving extreme wealth inequality, and you get social unrest and everything like that. And you showed a bunch of pictures from around the world, the different places experiencing these, like Mexico and some maybe Hong Kong. I don't know, some Asian locations he put up. But what do you want to talk about? I found it really interesting. It's kind of the first I first ran across his stuff about 2 years ago, and I did read the book. And Phil mentioned that he is reading the book now. Was reading it last night. This Cost of Tomorrow. But where do you want to take it from here, Phil?
Well, one of the things I want to say is that you're pointing out something in your discussion where you said you were trying to find a reason for a policy, but the reason wasn't there, and people just assumed. I use the example of tariffs. Now, every economics course I've ever taken, nearly every academic discussion that I've had, always suggested free trade, unrestricted trade, no tariffs, open market is a good thing, and we all benefit from it. And discussion ended, let's go on to something else. But I look back at that, and I can say, based on my education, which is really an undercapitalized asset, that's not what the historical period looked like. Especially the last couple hundred years now, particularly from the War of 1812 to World War I, there was huge economic expansion in the United States and constant dollar values. Very little. We were on the gold standard, and Andrew Jackson, for example, fought against the national bank. And people tend to demonize Jackson because of other aspects of his policy, but he was a people's president. And during that period, you have to describe, like the invention of the cotton gin. It was deflationary in that you could produce so much more product that everybody who had any kind of a wage, it was purchasable. Now, granted, it was grounded on a very, very sad system of slavery, but nevertheless, the United States grew to be, in that 100-year period I told you about, constant dollar value, increased productivity, population growth. By 1914, not too long after the central bank was created, the Federal Reserve, America grew to be the #1 economy in the world, not Great Britain. Great Britain was debt financed, exceedingly so, but they managed to do it without inflation because they had a concurrent expansion in the amount of goods and services be made available. And actually, now, as I think of it, during this period, maybe the second half of it, what we expected, what Marxists expected to happen was that things would get so bad that the proletariat would revolt. But that's not what happened at all. There's a whole school of an economic thought called Bernstein revisionism. And if I'm getting too obtuse here, ask me a question. But what basically he said was Marx was wrong. That's not what happened. What happened, at least during this period, is the lifestyle of the working classes, their life expectancy, their hopes, their future hopes for a future with public education grew. And I think if we could go back, people like me, to look at that period, not just through identity politics history, but actually a hard look. Well, how did we end up having the greatest railroad system in the world? A country that had a population of 4 million in 1812 and a population of almost 80 million, or maybe even 100 million, 110 million by 1914. What I mean to say is we can look at that, and then we can look at other economies that collapsed through inflation. And that collapse, there's a French theorist named Piketty who talks about how inflationary economics leads to political instability, and that political instability can lead to autocratic leaders, and those autocratic leaders can bring the world to the edge of the abyss. And I hadn't thought about it this way because I'm a liberal, and we liberals just don't talk about certain things. And I think we have to pay attention. There, especially now when we depend on a working class, when working class jobs are just disappearing. Einstein, of all things, I can't. Paul, what's the name of the guy?
Yeah,
there's another one too, who does narrative economics. I used to like him. I don't like him. I can't even remember his name now. But Einstein said you just have to look around you, and you can see that technology is destroying jobs. And the guy said, "Well, oh no, there's jobs all over the place. Yeah, if you want to pick up rubble and clean toilets and do all of the things that most people would rather not to do, because there's not the funding for the high skilled kind of jobs that there used to be, because those jobs are done by machines."
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure where this all goes. I mean, part of it is that individuals have got to make really important decisions about the trajectory of their lives. And if they don't, they'll be lucky to be working at a McDonald's in their retirement, or even having a retirement. Because part of the idea was economics makes not much of a difference what you spend things on. Where the boom is fueled by consumer spending. Consumer spending is debt finance, and it's debt finance to the extent that money is printed to put in the hands of the consumers, who now then find themselves burdened with the debt of having to pay it back, and an ever narrowing threshold of consumption. If you're spending $1,300 on rent a month and $20 to take your wife to lunch at McDonald's, then there's very little left. How is this machine financed? At the same time, when I took economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we talked about what we call social overhead capital. And what that means is that if you go over a rut in the road or something, you don't break an axle. It means that if you park your car in the wrong neighborhood, it doesn't get stripped and you find it sitting on a block. We end up we end up just assuming that all of that was free, and it never really was. One of the reasons why America pays half for oil what anybody else does is because the American Navy protects those oil tankers from piracy. I mean, and we assume that who did that? The Tooth Fairy? How did that come from?
Right.
You know, and why is it that we as Americans don't have to pay protection to our black chairman or something like that? We have most of the rest of the world. I worked with this guy named Tu Her, and he fought for the Cambodian resistance, and he told me about his refugee experience. And he said that they were staying, probably they're on the way to the United States. They were in Laos, and somebody turned on a boombox in a restaurant, and then he came around to everybody at the table and said, "This is for the music." And Tu said, "I don't like this music." And he said, "We pay for the music," you know. and and part of being an American, and I'm so surprised that we would want to give this away, is not having to pay those kind of bribes, not having to go in the room in the airport. And well, I won't even go there, but many of my stories are based on firsthand accounts. When we came through UK, you know, we there was a special American line for customs, and you got her there first. Now, dare I say, being first in that line is a good thing? Would I have been better morally if I sat out in that airport for 20 hours waiting to get on a flight, like I might some other place? I think not. Did I cover too much, Brock?
No, it was very interesting. Yeah, no, it's the interesting point you make, that I hadn't thought about. That is how, when you're talking about the oil and all that stuff, all that, everything that goes into it for us to be able to consume at the level that we do, at just
Yeah,
this insatiable lust for for energy, I guess. But it's almost like when people have kids and they try to make them earn an allowance or something so they understand the value of money. It's almost like we're a society that is, it's almost like you're just giving the kid the money because you just have the politicians print it.
yeah,
And so you're disconnected. There's like a complete disconnect over what that, what money actually is. Because if
yeah.
you,
It should be.
you don't see the, yeah, you don't see the true value in it. And so then you don't, because you don't value it the way that it should be valued, then politicians, just they succumb to the wishes and wants of the people. I mean, to some extent. And then it just fuels an ever expanding credit system.
Yeah,
So it's because there's like a disconnect. And I never thought of it that way. And so, like, what's the solution to, like, how does it, like, I mean, I think we're probably, I mean, I don't know what the outcome of all this is. I mean, he seems pretty dire. And like, I tend to be kind of like, I don't want to say pessimist, but I kind of, I don't know. I'm not as laid back about these kind of things as most people. And I don't think it's like, I may be able to get away in my lifetime, kind of sucking off the system the way that it currently is. But I mean, at some point it will. I mean, those two things can't. I do think his general thesis is correct. I don't know if his direness of the situation is, or I guess his immediacy of the problem, I don't know if he's right on that, but it's very interesting.
well, I'm going to take this a little bit of it's kind of a different way. But when we're talking about deflation and getting more for your money, uh, if you think about that in terms of military technology and the heroic Ukrainian performance in this invasion, we always assumed that It was the natural order. Us boomers, we assumed that there would never be another war again in Europe because we'd done that, and nice people didn't invade each other's countries, and we really had no need for protection. But what it is playing out now as we watch us struggle is any society that has to face an unopposed army in their homeland is in for really, really big trouble. And we have been really, really lucky as Americans that we have never had to face that, with the exception of the American Civil War. And you know what Sherman did to Atlanta. And what Sherman did to Atlanta is what Putin is really doing to Ukraine, which is to say, trying to destroy it as a society, if nothing else, so it can be it's like a negative, its existence criticizes every aspect of his kleptocracy, you know. And yet with the new technology available, we may find ourselves with, I want to say, self-reliant, smaller countries engaging in their own self-defense. You know, maybe that's something that's going to have to be learned again, as much as we despise militarism. I don't know the answer to it. Any ideas?
No. No, it's
But if in fact a major, maybe what we can do is, I want to give Tom Kemp for this. Tom Kemp, he's economist who I have a great deal of friendship and respect for, and he talked about the idea of a melding of the boundaries between nation state and corporate world. And he suggested that Putin's Russia was an archaic remainder of an archaic and anti-humanistic nation state, and that we were going to evolve into something different. And if in fact this was self-sufficient city-states or something like that as existed in ancient Greece, there might be a kind of political alternative that we could look at. Like, for example, in science fiction, there are some where it's not completely dystopic. There are examples of books written about what would happen if the United States fragmented, for example. What would people do? How would you defend a city if you didn't have tanks or something like that? What might you use? Well, it turns out now, apparently, swarms of drones are appearing on the battlefield in Ukraine, and I guess I sort of fought in the street during the '60s, you know, the war in Vietnam, and I think maybe generationally, not mine because I'm too old, people again are going to have to. I keep this Crosby, Stills song keeps running through my mind. Pay the cost of freedom, lay your bodies down. And that's entirely more optimistic than I intended to be. But that's what people are doing. And this idea of crowdfunding military technology, who would have thought that?
well,
Certainly.
it's interesting. Like, I guess let me know if I'm on point here, but I think what you're saying, your friend's Dr. Kemp's idea about, you know, basically I almost see it then as like Putin, you know, and his oligarchs, you know, in a world that's becoming more like corporatized and internationally tied together.
Yeah.
They're almost like you could think of them almost like a parasite or a tapeworm,
Mm-hmm.
where the host is the mother country, the host is Russia, but then they suck so much and they kind of isolate themselves because of of how they are, because of how the leadership is.
Yeah.
They kind of isolate themselves to the point where you have this tapeworm that, that's like Putin and the oligarchs, that grows bigger and bigger, and it just has an increased hunger and needs more nutrients, but the host is becoming, depleted of
Yeah.
of what the parasite needs. And so, because they're not connected with the rest of the world that's kind of flourishing through this trade network,
Yeah.
then the host, the country, has to try to go replete itself by attacking another host, i.e. Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting idea. So then you have all the other hosts, if you want to think of them as different nation states with different alliances. They see it as, well, we got this like parasite that's trying to take over another host.
Yeah.
If it takes over that host, it could take over us too. We're kind of tied, and we all come out ahead if we have this efficient exchange of goods and services between the different hosts. And we can't just let one parasite hijack the whole system. And so now that's kind of interesting, because everybody's kind of, collaborating to kill the parasite. So that's a really interesting framework too. I wouldn't have thought of it that way.
Well, you've got what you have there as an epidemiological model. And just within 2 days of this, Germany voted to double their military expenditure. Now, the Germans, the Germans have historically not been very nice people, but they see with Ukraine being invaded, what's next? Where does the epidemic spread next? And we came very close, especially after World War II and World War I. Kurt Vonnegut talks about those two world wars as two only barely unsuccessful suicide attempts by European culture to commit suicide. So,
yeah, it's like maybe this time, it's like you have a plague that's starting to form, but this time they're smart enough to say, hey, let's kill the rats.
nicely put. I mean, I mean it. And
like
then
maybe they learn something.
And you can tell, because of the information technology that's available, even if censorship is attempted, electronic information comes out, and you can actually see the combat. You can actually see the way that some of this technology is performing, and how surprising it is. I mean, military historians would probably be better to talk about this than me, but I'm the one that's doing it. I mean, Russia was famous for having the best anti-aircraft system in the world. They were famous for that ability. And it was something we always were concerned with. But Ukrainian drones are taking out Russian anti-aircraft sites, and nobody expected that. I think the left, my left, has to mobilize, get politically involved, and elect candidates who are not morons. And even, it's funny, I'm no friend to Nancy Pelosi, but I watched a Frontline special on her, and it was actually slanted to make you not like her, because she was so ruthlessly political. But that's what the left needs now, because when you're dealing with Republicans, they seem to be. I don't want to go too much farther there, but politics is a tough game, and it seems to me that as we've done this, I'm getting more politicized. I'm looking at some of the axiomatic positions that I used to sort of just default to, and rethinking about them.
Yeah, it's like, how long do you want to support people bringing a spoon to a gunfight? It's just, you might share certain core beliefs with the person that's bringing the spoon, but what good does it necessarily do to align with them if they're always bringing the spoon instead of bringing the gun? they're just not going to win. And so by supporting them, it just kind of perpetuates people bringing the spoon to the gunfight. I don't know. It's just,
Yeah.
I'm fed up with the whole system too. And I don't know what the answer is. Mine is probably, leave the country. But I'm fortunate that I have that option where most people don't.
Yeah. Well, you remember yesterday I sort of jokingly looked up our life expectancy. And according to mortality tables, you've got almost half of your life ahead of you. And even at my age and my wife's age, more than I thought, much more than I thought. And in a way, some of us who, have less to lose should maybe get more involved. I'm, I'm, I'm looking for the idea. I wasn't going to talk about policy because no-fly zones are really controversial. But on the other hand, I keep thinking, are we afraid of maybe making Putin mad? He wouldn't like us then, you know. I don't know. A humanitarian no-fly seems to me to be on the table at least. I just feel like we boomers have had it pretty good. And are you Gen X? I can't remember.
I don't even know. I don't even know where these cutoffs are, to be honest.
Yeah.
Probably.
Well, where do we go next with this?
Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to. I find the whole thing interesting. Is there any last thoughts on the Jeff Booth stuff? How that ties into any of this?
Well, I wanted to talk about my access to it, and I wanted to say that it's amazing that I have a book in my hand, and I've read it. And given that I need cataract surgery, and given that I need some other care what I'm going to give, that stuff was not even available, nor did I think about it when I was your age. It was just so. Remember when he said, "You can't find the solution inside the system."
Right.
What we need is something. Philosophy failed us because it's taught as doctrine that you can't have the Archimedean standpoint, which is to say, stand outside of a system that you're a part of, and yet somehow we have to do that, especially when people are taking history and falsifying it and using it as a justification to rationalize their position. You can't simply concede the battlefield. All right, I had something. I speak now again as an outsider, but about 30 years ago, I got on a military history discussion list. And there was some really interesting stuff about NATO on there. And then I got a message from this Dutch publisher asking me, to Professor Caveney, asking me what I thought about his new book series. And I said, I think he had listened to some of my comments on the discussion list. And he had said, well, what do you think of this, Mr. Caveney? I said, well, Professor Caveney. I said, well, I'm not Professor Caveney. I'm Phil Caveney, night janitor at Student Union in Madison, Wisconsin. He said, I don't care what you do for a living. What do you think of the book series? And I ended up reviewing the book and selling it for a couple $100 and sort of getting my. I think what, at least from the academic province, we gotta look at outsiders and outliers, and not just default to the Krugmans of the world and their intellectual laziness. I guess. When I heard him speak about inflation on the little symposium we looked at, he was both afraid and almost ashamed of himself. He's saying, well, I did actually try to talk to a couple manufacturers, I mean, talk to the person in the PDQ, for God's sake. Talk to the people that I work for that are wondering how. I'm not gonna use that word, but how the blank am I going to pay my rent of $1,300 a month? On $13 an hour. I mean, they got some questions. I mean, just think if physicists performed like that. I'm sorry about those calculations. We didn't mean for it to blow up.
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't feel it was necessary to go to the source. We just kind of asked somebody who might be in the know. We used the numbers they gave us, right? We plugged them into the formula.
One of the things I want to say about Booth, I want to picture a chessboard in my mind, and A1 is Queen Rook, right? Do I have that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, and so by the time you get to, is it H8? That's way over on the other side of the board.
Yep.
Now think of that as Moore's law, and think of what square on the board you might be. Let's say we're past the first rank, we're moving up, and each one of those doublings becomes more and more powerful in terms of the effect that Moore's law has on technology. And when they start talking about reaching up into the right-hand corner, that's of the board in terms of its multiplier effect. If you could put Moore's law together with a Keynesian multiplier and actually do some of the kind of work that's really needed as far as infrastructure, you could have almost a different kind of a New Deal if you could elect the kind of candidates we need to elect. I mean, I talk to people up here in Eau Claire, and people don't know who Joseph Stalin was. They just don't. And if they keep voting the way they are, they're gonna have to kiss somebody like Stalin's you know what, because that will be the next. I mean, we almost had that with Trump.
Hi.
Became dangerous. Hi, Jan. Well, do we want to do some kind of close, or how long have we gone?
Yeah. We'll wrap it up there, and then we'll be back hopefully next week with another one, huh?
Oh yeah, let's stay on and talk a little chess, okay?
Yeah. All right. Signing off.
All right, yeah.
All right.